The Holocaust Guilt Complex. First part. Why Israel is immune to criticism. What is so important about Israel that the behavior of its government and that government alone is allowed to hazard vital interests of the United States of America? There are three standard answers, and they all three undoubtedly contain an element of truth. But I'll argue there is yet a fourth element that is at least as important and that is more of a psychological nature than the three commonly adduced realistic reasons for Europe's and the USA's sticking to Israel no matter what it does. These two video essays are prompted by two recent events. The one widely noted in the established media, the other scarcely noted by them. The one is the recent bombing of the headquarters of the Syrian armed forces by Israel. This goes directly against certainly the American and frankly also against the Israeli national interest. In a region in which you have few real friends, and those few, such as Jordan, only pretend to be so because they are afraid of the USA, it is very ill-advised to antagonize one of your few potential new allies, the new regime in Syria, by bombing their headquarters. If only since, if you want to pursue your war with Iran, you will need access to Syrian airspace. But instead, Israel just goes off bombing them at the very first occasion. And this to the White House anger, as we have just learned. Netanyahu was titled a madman there, and Israeli foreign policy nowadays indeed seems to be to reach no further than to respect only the rights of the strongest and rely on bombs rather than rely on words. But if you randomly bomb them, can you then expect Syria to expel the Russian Air Force from its territory, which is what the US wants in the first place? Since in that case, Syria has no protection against Israeli bombs left whatsoever. Thus, Israel is actively damaging US interests, and with it, ultimately, its own interests as well. Less noted, but as significant, was a detail in the Moscow Victory Parade on 9 May. A platoon of the Egyptian border guards there marched past Putin and Xi Jinping, while Mohammed Sisi was present at the parade. Now, what were these Egyptians doing there? Given that Egypt and the US were not so long ago the biggest of buddies, and given that, as is clear by now, Hosni Mubarak was removed with at the very least CIA connivance because he was getting too close to Russia. Instead, Sisi's Egypt is now a candidate member of BRICS. And while it still tries to keep on good terms with Israel and the US, more out of fear than out of liking for the two of them, of course, it is very clear that it is increasingly distancing itself from the USA. The reason for that is of course obvious. Sisi cannot afford towards his own population to be too friendly with a government which is closely allied to a country which bombs hospitals or has children shot by snipers. children of people who, it cannot be repeated often enough, are for Egyptians not Palestinians but Arabs, just like them. How would Americans feel towards a government that is being accused of such respected institutions as Amnesty International of committing genocide on Americans? And yet the importance of Egypt cannot be gainsaid. It has always been and is now the most important country of the Arab world. And if it distances itself ever more from the US because of Israel, that severely damages critical US interests in a critical region. Egypt has 90 million inhabitants. Is it worth alienating it, and in fact the entire Arab world, and Iran plus Turkey in addition, nay, the entire Islamic world, including giant Indonesia and Nigeria, for the sake of a mere 7 million people and a tiny country? Why is Israel so important? The 3 standard reasons. The Israel lobby. The first standard reason adduced for that, and for politicians excusing Israel's behavior whatever it does, is both in Europe and in the USA the Israel lobby. There is no doubt that this lobby wields tremendous influence and tremendous amounts of money in both Europe and in the USA, and that it disposes of an instrument to knock out any opponent or potential opponent that cannot be beaten in addition. Namely, it can accuse anyone who does not 100% support Israel of anti-Semitism. Such an accusation effectually ends your political or academic career. In the US, there is simply no way you can be elected to Congress or would have any chance of running for the presidency if you not constantly declare you will back Israel whatever it does. That goes from Bernie Sanders over Kennedy to Lindsey Graham. The US now has the world's second largest Jewish community, which is by far the richest ethnic community in the USA, and one that wields simply enormous power over financial markets, over Hollywood, over publishing, or over academia, without implying that all Jews in academia are fans of Israel, of course. To the contrary, there are shining examples of such decades-long critics of Israel as Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein. The Arabs and Palestinians are in contrast a small and not very influential minority in the US. So that there is a hugely influential Jewish lobby in the USA is not surprising. What is surprising is that in European countries which have small Jewish communities and massive Islamic ones, the government still commonly chooses to back the Jews rather than the Muslims. Thus it antagonizes an already difficult large minority merely for the sake of a foreign government, one which not even all the Jews support. Britain, for example, has 4.1 million Muslims and perhaps 300,000 Jews. Yet the Israel lobby there is still so powerful that Jeremy Corbyn's run for the premiership was ruined by allegations he was an anti-Semite, because he had supported the Palestinian cause over the previous decades. So too, any criticism of Israel in the Netherlands which now has 30,000 Jews on 900,000 Muslims, is completely out of the question. People who raise the Palestinian flag from their house there risk having it taken down by the police. Any criticism of Israel will immediately be denounced as anti-Semitism, even though there are in the Netherlands too brave Jewish critics of Israel, such as the good people of Een Ander Joods Geluid and the art historian Thomas van der Dunk. Even stranger is the situation in France, where the Jewish community is 483,000 people strong and there are 6 million Muslims. Yet where the established media still fall over each other to pledge support to Israel. Via the talking head of the pro-Israel lobby on France TV, philosopher and multimillionaire Jean-Bernard Lévy, and the Holocaust monger, as Finkelstein calls him, Alain Finkielkraut, to the normal TV anchors. So the pro-Israel money and influence clearly goes very far now, for France has always prided itself on being the great civilizing force in the Arab countries, and it always used to boast on how well France and Arabs understood each other. And indeed, the Arab countries of the Middle East, both French ex-colonies such as Lebanon and the English ex-colony Egypt, have been Francophiles for ages. Alexandria, not for nothing, has still a strong whiff of Marseille to it, and Beirut is still the Paris of the Middle East. Yet France is now squandering all that traditional Arab goodwill for the sake of the government of Israel. It is clearly a lobby, organized by Israel and even more so by American Jews. For there is an interesting, different and opposite case. Jewish influence in Russia is tremendous too. The Russian oligarchs are in majority Jewish, and the Jews have long had as enormous a role in Russian academic or cultural life as in the USA. But while Russia admittedly tries to maintain good relations with Israel for the sake of the Jews and for the sake of the hundreds of thousands of Jewish Russian emigrants to Israel, it has in the final instance always backed the Arabs when the choice went between them and Israel. And all this while there are no Arabs in Russia at all. The reason is obviously that the American Jews-backed Israel lobby has no influence in Russia, and it has far less influence in Eastern Europe too. If governments there pander to Israel, that is either to please America or because they see the Likud as a fellow right-wing party, as Hungary's Viktor Orban does, for example. The second standard reason, the Christian lobby. The second factor in the unflinching support for Israel, which is clearly important as well, and which is particularly so in the USA, is the influence of the fundamentalist Christians. They, basically, are waiting for the second coming of Christ. This to them will not happen unless the Promised Land, and the whole of the Promised Land, including Gaza and the West Bank, is controlled by Jews. This is the main reason for that unofficial American financial support to the building of new settlements in the West Bank, which at least the Obama administration officially condemned, and where particularly American Jews move to in Israel, since it is the cheapest accommodation available and you get tax benefits if you go to live in the West Bank. Electorally, the Christians are a far more important group than the Jews, with some 40 million voters. voters who are furthermore particularly concentrated in the southern states, which are electorally heavily overrepresented in Congress. They too make it electoral suicide for any American candidate for the presidency or Congress to not out and out support Israel. In Europe this factor is less important, and in Britain, France or Italy it plays hardly any role at all. But the small Protestant parties, who are however a dwindling minority of votes in the Netherlands, have always been and are ardent supporters of Israel, as incidentally is the so-called far-right leader Geert Wilders too, though this is more of a kind of personal hang-up of him, as he did volunteer work in Israel as a teenager and then fell madly in love with the country, as you so often happen to fall in love at that age. The similar right-wing Alternative für Deutschland is, by the way, also very pro-Israel. The third standard reason: Israel as armored fist of the USA. The third argument, often adduced, is that Israel is supported as it is the armored fist of the USA in the world's main oil-producing region. This argument undoubtedly held during the Cold War, when Israel was indeed the West's main ally and the only one armed to the teeth by the West, when almost all Arab countries, Syria, Libya, Egypt until 1973, Iraq and Yemen, were Russian allies and armed by the USSR, while the really important countries, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, had a non-existent military. Israel proved time and time over again it could defeat the USSR armed countries and thus keep the oil-producing countries safely in America's orbit. It should in this respect never be forgotten that in the 50s the USA tried to stay neutral in the Israel-Arab conflict of 1956, the Suez Crisis, and that it only began to tilt towards Israel when it proved in the Six-Day War in 1967 it was militarily stronger than the Arab countries, however much the USSR had tried to militarily buff them up. For many in Washington, the Cold War has evidently never ended. Or rather, it is a typical case of so father so son, as you say in Dutch. As their fathers were ardent Cold War warriors, so their sons have taken over their entire pattern of thinking. A vehement hatred of Russia under whatever regime, and the thinking in terms of deterrence and containment. And linked to all that, out and out support of Israel as the present and future bulwark against Russia and its stooges in the Middle East. Looked at it more soberly though, on the moment Israel has become a liability rather than an asset for the USA. Not only has it at massive costs to divert fleet assets to the Red Sea to protect the shipping to Israel, and conduct ineffective and expensive airstrikes against Yemen merely so as to intimidate the Houthis on behalf of Israel, but also during the recent shootout of Israel with Iran, it had to divert those priceless air defense assets it is so desperately short of to defend Israeli airspace. The USA has now almost habitually to use its military. It has to hazard the lives of American boys and girls, that is, to get Israel out of trouble, rather than that Israel is the kind of useful military subcontractor for the USA it was during the Cold War. other arguments for the all-out support for Israel, such as that it must be supported because it is the only democracy in the Middle East, do not wash at all. Has the USA ever all-out supported India, for example, whatever its government does? No, it commonly sides with its enemy, Pakistan, instead. Although India is as old a democracy as Israel, and it is a shining example to the entire global south that democracy is possible there. If the USA really cared about democracy, it should be the closest partner of India, whereas Israel is on the brink of it, a narrow ethno-democracy, which is no shining example for democracy at all. It is a democracy for Jews amongst each other, but excludes everybody else, much like the whites in apartheid South Africa were also an exemplary democracy among the whites. The Holocaust guilt complex. And yet of the brink of it, while these three causes for the out-and-out support for Israel have all undoubtedly an element of truth to them, the Russian counterexample proves that this is not all there is to it. I think that more important than all of those three elements is the relentless hammering of Israel on the collective guilt the West has for the Holocaust. This is coupled to a whole commemoration industry that has shot up round that supposed collective guilt of the West, and that has succeeded in implanting a collective guilt consciousness in the West European and American populations. The feeling that while the 6 million were being killed, the world, that is the West, looked the other way. As the Israeli government spokesman and Israel fans repeat on every occasion. To atone for those collective sins of their fathers and grandfathers, it is now the supreme moral duty of their children never to abandon the Jews once again, as they did during the Shoah. The Israel lobby and the Holocaust industry, as Finkelstein calls it, has over time been so successful in implanting this collective guilt complex that other groups are meanwhile trying to imitate them, such as blacks in Britain, the Netherlands or France. Following the Israel lobby's example, they try to make the present population feel guilty of the historic crimes they committed in the times of slavery. While in Germany, not involved in slavery, they try to make them feel guilty for the mass murder on the Herero in Namibia in 1905, or in Italy for the use of poison gas during the conquest of Ethiopia in 1936. But such attempts to secure privileges for blacks as a payback for the sins committed by the West in the times of slavery or of colonization have been far less successful than Israel has been in implanting its guilt complex in Western Europe. This is partly, patently, since the Holocaust was particularly gross. After all, slavery in America was a system of industrial exploitation. It was not intended to murder the slaves, as the Shoah was. But also, as the black diaspora does have the greater numbers, but it lacks the funds, the good organization, and the influence of the Israel lobby in education, in the media, or on the internet. The paradoxical consequence of this relentless hammering on the Holocaust, so as to implant a collective guilt complex into the population, is that the Second War itself is moving ever further away in European public consciousness, as could clearly be expected after 80 years. In the Netherlands there is, for example, still nominally an observance of a 5-minute collective silence on the commemoration day of the war on the 4th of May. But while in my memory 60 years ago the whole country indeed fell silent at 7 o'clock, now nobody observes that silence anymore. But the less the public knows about the Second World War and the less interested it is, the larger the Holocaust looms. Indeed, the Shoah is now practically the only thing young Americans or Dutchmen still know about the Second World War. The Shoah in the immediate post-war. This is completely different from the situation immediately after the war. The particular Jewish tragedy then did not loom very large in the collective consciousness in France, in Belgium or in the Netherlands, whereas it was hardly mentioned in Eastern Europe at all. Though clearly most Jews were killed there. In the latter countries, probably 4 million on 5.3 million total victims of the Holocaust. But the Shoah was in Poland's collective consciousness overshadowed by the Nazi massacres of Polish intellectuals or by the memory of Poland's new national myth, the Warsaw Uprising of June 1944, led by the Bonden Polish government. In Hungary, the deportation to Auschwitz and the gassing of the Jews of Budapest was seen as part of the sufferings of Budapest's population at large, which the Red Army had to capture in bitter street-to-street and house-to-house fighting in February 1945, and where tens of thousands perished. Whereas in the Baltic countries the sufferings of the Jews were forgotten in what was afterwards conceived as the far greater tragedy of the war, the mass deportation of Baltic elites to Siberia, or the loss of their independence. For the war really went on there until 1949 between the Red Army and the militias and partisans of the so-called Forest Brothers. In the Western European consciousness, immediately after the war, central to the collective memory of World War II was also not the fate of the Jews. That had taken place far away in Poland, in Sobibor or in Auschwitz, the two camps which processed, in Nazi jargon, the Western European Jews anyway. Rather central than those names to collective memory then were the ones of villages whose inhabitants were murdered by the Nazis as collective retaliation against deeds of the resistance. Oradour-sur-Glane in France or Velsen in the Netherlands. It was at the time felt that the entire population, and not just the Jews, had suffered during the war. And the two events which the media then constantly dwelt on were in the Netherlands, on the one hand the heroic resistance of the Dutch army, led by Queen Juliana's consort Bernhard, and the terror bombing of Rotterdam, and on the other the last winter of the war, the so-called Hunger Winter. There was of course an awareness horrible things had been done to the Jews in the concentration camps, but it was felt they had suffered just like other inmates of the camps had suffered as well. Communists, people of the resistance, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. And it is nowadays, when everybody only focuses on Jews in the camps, perhaps not superfluous to recall that in most concentration camps, besides the death camps, which were built to process the Jews from Warsaw or Lodz, Belzec, Sobibor and Majdanek, the Jews were in the minority everywhere else, and there were scarcely any Jews in such large camps as Sachsenhausen, Flossenburg, Ravensbrück and Dachau, in which opponents of the Nazi regime were incarcerated. In France, the Netherlands and Belgium, the Holocaust was thus at that time not much stressed, and the history of the war was rather told in the immediate post-war period as a national deliverance story, on how the nation had been under the Nazi boot for 4 or 5 years, after which it had heroically liberated itself under respectively Charles de Gaulle and Queen Wilhelmina, with some minor English and American assistance, to be sure. During this dark period of the occupation, all classes and all creeds and ideologies had heroically stood shoulder to shoulder to fight that Nazi oppression of which the Shoah was merely a part. Central to the image of the war was hence the resistance rather than the destruction of the Jews, for which there was in that period not so much interest. The ending of the post-war consensus, the Jewish story. It was then rather felt that the Jews should cease nagging about the war and get on with their lives, much as other sorts of people who had been in concentration camps too were told to do as well. This was actually a feeling that was at a time also shared by the Jewish community itself, both in Western Europe and in the USA. It was felt that it would not be good for Jewish self-respect to emphasize the Jewish victim role too much. This image of the war as a national deliverance story for the Gentiles and as a near embarrassment for the Jews began to gradually crumble late in the 60s due to several different reasons. One reason was from the Jewish side, as they experienced it, miraculous triumphs the Israeli Defense Force scored over the Arab armies in 1967 and 1973. Triumphs which at least hinted at divine providence. The problem with the Holocaust for the Jews had been so far the Théodicée, the question why Yahweh had permitted this sacrifice by fire. Hence the Jews had remained somewhat hesitant to discuss the Shoah at all. For if you are God's chosen people, why has this happened to you? What merciful God would permit this to be inflicted on his own people? But with the Jewish triumphs of the 6 days and the Yom Kippur Wars, the Holocaust could now be framed as part of the national redemption story. The Jewish people had to pass through the ordeal of the Holocaust to reach the promised land of Israel. The Israeli population has since been reared in that redemption story, and it structures the constant commemorations of the Holocaust in Israel. It was the ultimate trial the chosen people had to go through before returning to their land of milk and honey, where if they just restore Israel to its biblical borders, that is the West Bank, Gaza, plus the Golan Heights, they can now safely wait for the coming of the Messiah. This Israel redemption story had, however, to emphasize the Jewish position as Yahweh's chosen people, and that the Jews had nothing in common with others. Hence the official line in Israel is that the disaster that the Jews had suffered is a unique event in history. so that the reward for it has to be commensurately large as well. Otherwise, you could of course everywhere start granting lands to people which are now possessed by others merely for the sake of any sufferings they have endured in their past. Thus, for example, Eastern Anatolia should then be allowed to the Armenians for their suffering during the First World War. All pieces of Africa should be allotted to African Americans as compensations for slavery, as Marcus Garvey actually wanted in the 1920s. And that redemption story has to stress as well that the Jews, as Yahweh's chosen people, have nothing to expect from those Gentiles, those Chaim, who are universally hostile to them. A rage that can erupt at any moment, so that they are in constant peril and therefore need a safe refuge more than other peoples do. For otherwise, every people who merely feel discriminated would have a right to proclaim their own state on somebody else's territory as well, as in Louis Farragut's idea of establishing a separate African American land somewhere in the southern USA, on what is strictly speaking Cheyenne land, to atone for the evils of slavery and of discrimination. Thus, two perpetual favorites of the Holocaust industry discourse. That the Jews are always victimized by the Chaim for no reason whatsoever, and the forever talk about the looming threat of a renewed wave of murderous anti-Semitism. For the pro-Israel lobby and commentators, we are forever living in February 1933, just before the coming of Hitler. The ending of the post-war consensus, the Gentile story. From the non-Jewish side, there were local reasons why the post-war consensus of a national community which had heroically resisted the Nazi occupation to the last man and woman gradually crumbled. In France, the war in Algeria played an important role. Such events as the violent repression of anti-war demonstrations by the police chief of Paris, Maurice Papon, who had already been in that function under the Vichy regime, or the leaking out of the torture practiced by the French army on the fighters of the Algerian Front Libération Nationale. All this made the French army seem no better than the Gestapo, and it highlighted the highly questionable role of the French police and of the bureaucracy during the Vichy times too. It did, however, need an English historian, Robert Paxton, to point out in 1973 that rather than being the lamentable exception, as the mass of the French population supposedly heroically aided the resistance and fought the Germans, that collaborationist regime of Vichy was widely supported by particularly the Church and by the traditional French right, as well as by many, nay, the majority of the bureaucracy. That indeed, in 1940 and 1941, there was little resistance at all to Vichy, which was widely seen as the legitimate order. The realization that the then still sitting establishment in the 60s had widely collaborated with the Germans 20 years earlier tallied with the anti-authoritarian revolt of 1968, which was also an uprising against their fathers by the young. All the former authority figures could now be conceived to have, rather than heroically resisted, to have largely shamefully collaborated with, or at least to have scantily resisted the Nazis. In the Netherlands, a rather similar role to Algeria and to 1968 was played by the so-called Weinreb affair, and the role of that Paxton by historian Jacques Presselman and his book Ondergang, which showed that the persecutions of the Jews were largely arranged by the Dutch authorities themselves and that the Germans played only a marginal role in it. This too could be interpreted in the anti-authoritarian mood of the late 60s as implying that rather than that the Dutch vested authorities had heroically resisted the Germans, as they had always been claiming they did, they had rather collaborated with them. As the people who had responsible positions in wartime disappeared from the scene in the 80s and in the 90s, that period saw an explosion of interest in the Holocaust, with Steven Spielberg's legendary Schindler's List movie, the monster 13 hours documentary Shoah by Claude Lanzmann, and the Hollywood series Holocaust, which led to a lot of discussion, particularly in Germany, which, as I may cynically observe, became possible now that judges, police commissioners or senior soldiers and bureaucrats who had added in the organization of the Holocaust and had largely remained in their old functions in West Germany had died or were at least long pensioned. This made the whole topic of the Holocaust largely theoretical and hence far less threatening to the entire order in the Federal Republic of Germany than it had been before. All this too made a kind of German-Israel entente possible, in which it was now deemed by Israel to have atoned for its sins sufficiently if its government just supported that of Israel under any circumstance, and it critically would urge other European states to do the same. The many shades of grey consensus. From the 80s on, as the generation which had still experienced the war left the scene, and after all the criticism of the old view that the nation had heroically resisted the Germans, this old vision was gradually replaced by a new consensus. While in the old vision the war had been between the white of the good, of our side, that of the resistance and the followers of Wilhelmina or Charles de Gaulle, and them, the pitch black side, that is of the Germans, their direct collaborators, of the fascist parties, and of the paramilitary forces, the milice of Vichy, who in 1944 waged a cruel little war with the Maquis resistance, the French War. In the new consensus, the war was instead conceived as many shades of grey. Most of the people during the war, this consensus argued, tried to survive one way or another, and they were mostly only concerned with and preoccupied with their everyday miseries. And given that ever fewer food and ever fewer clothes were available, as the war lasted longer, and obtaining just one pair of shoes or a morsel of bread was a long struggle, and a victory, this is very well understandable too. Few people were ardent fascists, but even fewer were resistance fighters, and many indeed condemned the resistance, since such acts as shooting a German officer would trigger German retaliation. Hundreds of random French or Dutchmen, although, to be sure, the Dutch armed resistance consisted of a few dozen people. The consequence of that the population was occupied with its daily troubles was that the Jews were largely ignored too. Most people did not want to know what was happening with them. They had enough troubles of their own to worry about those of others. There is undoubtedly a great deal of truth to this new view. And in Poland, in Yugoslavia or in Ukraine, this was even more so than in Western Europe, since Nazi repression was far worse there than in Western Europe. most people there were far too busy to stay alive to care much for what happened to the Jews. However, certainly in such a very political field as the study of World War II, historical research is never only driven by the impartial search for the truth, but the present emphasis on that most of the population were no active Nazis but were no resistors too, is politically convenient as well. First, it devalues the resistance, which in the new consensus is supposed to have been only a very small and marginal community with a small role, and to have been of no military and slight moral significance. This is of critical political importance, since the resistance was in France, and indeed throughout Europe, except in Poland, left and socialist leaning, generally opposed to the old industrial and agricultural elites, and the leading role in the resistance was commonly played by the communists. After the war, the French Communist Party often, and with much justification, called itself the Parti des Fusillés, the party of those executed by the Nazis, and millions voted for the communists because of the tremendous prestige they had attained during the war. If you kicked against the prestige of the resistance, you therefore hurt that of the Communist Party too, and the emphasis on how the overwhelming mass of the population was not involved in the resistance was therefore part of the broad offensive that started in France after the accession of the first Mitterrand government in 1982, in which the communists for the first time participated in a Western European country, to divide, to attack and to smear the communists in any way, of which the so-called post-modern thought of that time was also a part. Second, if the mass of the population was neither black nor white, that makes the ones who associated with the Nazis rather than who directly collaborated with them also look much better. They were behaving just like all the others. And this stance of not actively supporting the Nazis but rather working constructively with the occupation authorities was generally the one the administrative, financial, industrial and agrarian elites in Belgium, the Netherlands and France assumed. While this had been a painful fact that was generally glossed over in the times of the national consensus, that the entire country had supposedly resisted the Germans, this association with the Nazis looked a whole lot better now that most of the population was conceived as having acted in the same way. And thirdly, according to this new consensus, most of the population indeed looked away while the 6 million were killed, just as the Holocaust industry argued at the same time. Did this, however, result from a widespread resentment of the Jews? That question we shall consider in the next video essay.